In the opulent quiet of Windsor Castle, a single sentence from a child echoed louder than any royal decree. "She is not my queen." When Princess Charlotte uttered those 6 words, the palace stood still. A moment so intimate yet so politically explosive, it forced the monarchy to question its very image. What drove the future queen to make such a declaration, and what dark history lies behind her words? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was supposed to be a private gathering, a moment of royal unity following the formalities surrounding Queen Camilla's growing public role. A delicate balance hung in the air, titles, traditions, and tensions silently dictating every move. As the family assembled in the drawing room, the focus turned to the younger royals, particularly the ones expected to usher in a more modern monarchy. In the middle of soft murmurs and exchanged pleasantries, it happened. A quiet, deliberate phrase from the lips of Princess Charlotte sliced through the polished silence like a razor. "She is not my queen." No raised voice, no dramatic tantrum, just pure, intentional defiance, delivered with the poise of someone far older than her 9 years. The room froze. Camilla, seated nearby with a well-rehearsed smile, paused. Her expression barely shifted, yet those closest could sense the sharp tension in her spine. A slight narrowing of the eyes. An unreadable look that betrayed not anger but fear. For a woman who had fought decades for public acceptance, the sting of rejection from within the family struck deeper than any tabloid headline. The phrase wasn't just a personal snub, it was a symbolic dagger aimed at the very legitimacy of her crown. And it came from the future. William said nothing at first. His jaw tensed, his fingers interlocked more tightly. He didn't need to look at Catherine to know she had heard it too. Her reaction was quiet, her eyes briefly lowered, lips parted as if she wanted to interject, but stopped herself. There was no correction, no parental scolding. Just a wall of silence that spoke volumes. The weight of that moment didn't go unnoticed by the staff. The air shifted. Conversations resumed but were hollow. Performed. Behind the scenes, aides exchanged subtle glances, unsure whether to pretend it hadn't happened or to prepare for the fallout. Within hours, someone whispered the story to a journalist. By morning, it was everywhere. Tabloid headlines danced across breakfast tables in bold type: "Princess Charlotte snubs Camilla." News anchors speculated, commentators dissected the phrase, and social media exploded in a frenzy. What had seemed like an innocent moment had evolved into a national spectacle. But beneath the surface, the stakes were far more dangerous. Because the truth was clear, this wasn't a childish rebellion. It wasn't about etiquette or discipline. It was about legacy, loyalty, and a growing resistance from within the House of Windsor itself. As whispers turned to headlines, one question gripped the nation: was this simply a child's rebellion, or something far more orchestrated and deeply rooted in royal vengeance? Behind Charlotte's words was a name left unspoken, yet powerfully present: Diana. The woman stripped of her title, humiliated by the firm, and replaced in the public eye. Could her granddaughter be carrying the weight of Diana's pain into a new generation of silent rebellion? Though Diana's portrait still hangs in certain corners of royal estates, her memory lives in shadows and carefully rehearsed silences, in glances exchanged during ceremonies, in the spaces where her voice was once meant to echo. The monarchy worked tirelessly to polish over her story, reframe her legacy, and reshape public perception. Yet the scars of that erasure were never healed. They were passed on, not through history books, but through blood. William, her firstborn, never spoke publicly of the depths of his trauma. But in private, his entire world was shaped by the collapse of hers. And now, all these years later, that pain long dormant may have stirred again in his daughter. Charlotte, born into a palace built on tradition, was also raised within a home defined by its emotional awareness. William and Catherine made a deliberate choice to shelter their children not only from the media's cruelty, but from the coldness that once consumed the royal household. Yet even in the most protected spaces, children listen. They absorb. They inherit. Charlotte, with her quiet intensity and strong moral compass, may never have known Diana personally, but the loss of her presence was never truly absent. It lingered in every retelling, every hesitated phrase, every time William's voice broke when speaking of his mother. There were clues subtle, but deliberate. At a public memorial, Charlotte was seen wearing a delicate brooch, identical to one worn by Diana decades ago. It was no accident. It wasn't a stylistic tribute orchestrated by palace aides. It was a gesture of remembrance, perhaps even defiance, stitched silently into the pageantry. Catherine, who has long studied Diana not just as a predecessor but as a cautionary tale, is said to have chosen the brooch herself, but it was Charlotte who wore it with quiet pride. No one needed to explain its significance. The message was already alive in her, etched into the very lineage of pain she carries. And while the public has been conditioned to accept Camilla's rise as a necessary evolution of the monarchy, not everyone within those palace walls views it as rightful. For many, her crown is a symbol of compromise, not continuity. Despite the exhaustive media campaigns, the affectionate titles, the strategic appearances, there remains a bitter taste in the mouths of those who remember what was taken from Diana. For Charlotte, who exists because Diana once endured, the reality of that history is more than gossip, it's personal. A crown that once might have adorned her grandmother's head now sits atop another's. And though Charlotte may never have verbalized this complexity, her recent words suggest a consciousness far deeper than anyone anticipated. William's silence following Charlotte's remarks spoke volumes. Not as a father caught off guard, but as a son who once watched his own mother be vilified and dismissed. His protectiveness over Charlotte's autonomy mirrored the defense he was never able to provide Diana. And in that choice not to correct, not to silence, he gave her permission to carry that legacy forward, in her own voice, on her own terms. If Diana's shadow haunts the monarchy, then Charlotte's words may have reopened old wounds the firm desperately tried to bury. Princess Charlotte was never meant to be silent. Behind the curated smiles and carefully brushed hair is a young royal taught to think, question and lead. But who exactly is raising her? And what values have been instilled that could challenge the monarchy itself? From the moment she entered public consciousness, Charlotte was different. Not just because of her position, but because of the way she carried it. Unlike the generations before her, she was not cloaked in blind obedience. William and Catherine, determined to rewrite the rules of royal parenting, made a conscious choice to raise their daughter with a mind of her own, not merely as a subject of the crown, but as someone who could one day shape it. In their private world, duty was never separated from dialogue. Charlotte wasn't told what to do, she was taught why it mattered. And when it didn't make sense, she was encouraged to ask. That single value, autonomy, may now be the greatest threat to the institution that surrounds her. In the halls of Kensington and Windsor, Charlotte was never shielded from reality. She was nurtured in emotional intelligence, encouraged to speak when something felt wrong, to defend others, to understand context. There's a weight in being a royal, but her parents ensured she would never carry it blindly. This quiet foundation became visible in moments the public dismissed as charming quirks. When she corrected her brother, Prince George, during a formal procession, it wasn't mischief. It was instinct, an internal compass that told her ceremony without meaning was just noise. When she greeted officials with confidence, standing tall without hesitation, it wasn't rehearsed, she was simply raised to own her space, not shrink from it. Charlotte is not being raised in Charles's world. Her gaze is set on a future shaped by William and Catherine. That difference is seismic. She is closer in age to her father's reign than to her grandfather's, and perhaps that's why her loyalty already leans toward a monarchy reshaped, not reinforced. The firm, once a fortress of silence and compliance, is now being observed from the inside by a generation unwilling to pretend. In their effort to modernize the monarchy by humanizing it, opening it up, softening its edges, they may have unintentionally created something far more dangerous, a royal with a conscience. And behind that evolution, there's Catherine, always poised, always controlled in public, but within the family her influence runs deep. It is she who walks the tightrope between diplomacy and truth-telling, who teaches Charlotte the cost of silence and the courage of clarity. Catherine knows the pressure of being cast in someone else's legacy. She knows how quickly kindness can be weaponized, how often women are asked to bear the burdens of history with a smile. So she raises her daughter differently, not to defy for defiance's sake, but to understand when silence serves the system more than the soul. And when Charlotte refused to call Camilla queen, it wasn't a slip, it wasn't a tantrum. It was a quiet verdict. The kind of verdict only someone raised to know the weight of titles could ever deliver. But if Charlotte's quiet rebellion was the spark, then Buckingham Palace's reaction was the wildfire. Within 24 hours, royal aides were summoned. Damage control spiraled into chaos. PR strategies collided with royal ego, and behind closed doors, Camilla demanded an apology. But what she got instead was silence. The walls of Buckingham Palace have seen many crises, but none quite like this. A child's sentence, delivered without fanfare, had triggered an emergency response usually reserved for scandals of global consequence. Phones rang relentlessly, corridors filled with tense whispers, and advisors rushed to contain a story already devouring the headlines. In hastily assembled briefings, senior courtiers were instructed to neutralize the sentiment, a phrase that barely masked the deeper panic. This wasn't just bad press. This was an uncontainable fracture in the royal image, one that couldn't be explained away or deflected with charm. It had come from within, and worse, from the heir's daughter. Behind the scenes, Camilla was furious. She wasn't asking for public condemnation, at least not yet. She wanted something more personal, more symbolic, a private acknowledgement from William and Catherine that the remark was out of line. A chance to reassert her place not just in the public imagination, but in the family's structure. She proposed a private sit-down, a controlled discussion to clear the air. But Catherine refused. Calmly, firmly. She made it clear there would be no retraction, no forced apology from a child who had only spoken her truth. It was a move Camilla hadn't anticipated, and it infuriated her. This wasn't a mother failing to discipline her child. This was a mother protecting her daughter's right to feel. Charles, caught between the old and new, tried to mediate. His instinct was to preserve harmony. But what he encountered was the quiet force of a son unwilling to compromise his daughter's voice. William didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "She meant it." That sentence ended the conversation. There would be no spin, no correction, no carefully crafted public statement offering context. And when palace aides floated the idea of releasing a vague, pre-approved statement from Charlotte affirming her respect for all members of the family, William shut it down before it left the room. Outside the gates, the media storm intensified. Headlines questioned whether this was a blunder or a bombshell. Theories flooded the internet. Was this rebellion a signal of William's hidden rift with his father? Was Charlotte being used, or was she simply unafraid? Hashtags like "She is not my queen" and #Princess of the People trended worldwide. The firm was losing the public relations battle, not because they weren't prepared, but because they didn't understand the rules had changed. The public didn't want polished statements. They wanted authenticity. And Charlotte, without even trying, had given them more of it than the monarchy had in years. Behind the numbers, deeper tremors could be felt. A subtle dip in Charles's approval ratings appeared in several polls, not dramatic, but significant enough to suggest that the public wasn't ready to forget what had been said. A generational divide was widening, and the old guard was losing its grip on the narrative. But this wasn't just a family squabble, it was the beginning of a generational rupture that threatened to split the monarchy from within. Camilla's crown had always been fragile, earned not through legacy but survival. Yet with a single phrase from a child, that crown began to tremble. And behind her composed smile, the queen consort knew she was losing the future. For years, Camilla fought tooth and nail to transition from scandal to sovereignty. She was never meant to wear a crown. Not in the eyes of a public who once painted her as the villain in a love triangle too tragic for fiction. Her image had been rebuilt, repackaged, and reframed over decades. Carefully crafted documentaries, softened interviews, and palace-sanctioned narratives worked tirelessly to reintroduce her not just as Charles's wife, but as a queen in her own right. And for a time it seemed to work. The nation adjusted. The cameras stopped lingering on her unease. The headlines softened. But deep down, she knew her title rested on unstable ground. She hadn't inherited it. She had taken it from the aftermath of heartbreak, and the world had not forgotten. When Charlotte's words resurfaced in the public arena, Camilla felt the earth shift beneath her feet. She wasn't hearing the innocent opinion of a child, she was hearing an echo of the past. A ghost of Diana's shadow, alive in the next generation. It hit her harder than she expected. Not because of what was said, but because of who said it. Charlotte represented the future. And the future had just rejected her. In that moment, Camilla was no longer queen consort. She was again the other woman, standing on the outside of a legacy she thought she had finally entered. Behind palace doors, her fury erupted in private. She demanded a conversation, not with Charlotte but with her parents. She insisted that the statement be addressed, that it be publicly corrected, or at the very least reprimanded within the family. But when the call came through, it wasn't what she expected. William's voice was calm, resolute, and unmistakably final. She spoke her truth. I won't silence her. There was no wiggle room, no room for negotiation. Just the sound of a father standing in the space his own father had never occupied, defending a woman in his family, instead of controlling her. The refusal didn't just sting, it spiraled. Camilla's confidence, once carefully protected by palace aides and sympathetic press, began to fracture. What else had they been saying behind closed doors? Was Charlotte the only one who felt this way, or was she merely the first to speak it aloud? Camilla began to see ghosts in every glance, in every nod of the head that didn't come quickly enough. She grew suspicious of her own staff, paranoid of briefings she wasn't copied into. For all her years navigating scandal, nothing had prepared her for being quietly erased by the new generation. Not through a scandal, but through indifference. One evening, in a moment of frustration, Camilla made a call to Charles. It was brief, clipped, measured. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, but her words were sharp and loaded. You told me they'd come around. There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make it clear that Charles didn't have an answer, long enough for her to realize that maybe, just maybe, they never would. As Camilla's crown tilted in the public eye, another power was quietly rising, and it wasn't Charles or Camilla, it was Charlotte. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has always been the palace's elegant diplomat. But few know of the quiet lessons she shares with her daughter about strength, boundaries, and truth. And in those late-night moments, a pact was formed, to honor what others erased. It wasn't forged in ceremony or sealed with crowns. It was born in a simple conversation behind closed doors, a moment between mother and daughter that would ripple across generations. On the eve of a major state event, Charlotte had been preparing, her questions sharp, her curiosity bolder than expected. Among the carefully chosen gowns and protocol reminders, she turned to her mother and asked with piercing innocence, "Why is Camilla called queen if Diana was first?" The air grew still. Catherine, ever composed in the public eye, found herself stripped of her usual scripts. There was no briefing for this, no protocol guide for how to answer a child asking why her grandmother's legacy had been rewritten. She didn't respond immediately. There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of wait. And when she did speak, her voice carried something deeper than explanation. It carried resolve. She told Charlotte the truth, not the media's truth, not the palace's truth, but the truth that lives in the gaps between headlines. That Diana had once been a princess adored by the world. That her voice had been silenced, her title taken, her pain ignored. But she was never erased in the hearts of those who remembered. Catherine didn't speak with resentment. She didn't need to. Her restraint made the message louder. She made sure Charlotte knew the difference between what is said publicly and what must be carried privately. It wasn't about stirring bitterness. It was about acknowledging the emotional inheritance that comes with royalty. That sometimes survival requires silence, but legacy demands remembrance. Charlotte listened. She didn't cry. She didn't ask more. She simply nodded. In that exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something stronger than duty, deeper than blood. A pact, not spoken aloud but understood. That no matter what titles others wore, Charlotte would never forget the woman who should have worn the crown first. From that day forward, Catherine no longer needed to correct or explain. Charlotte understood what it meant to live within a system that praises composure over truth. But Catherine, in her own quiet rebellion, had gifted her daughter something rare within the monarchy: permission to see clearly. To know that history isn't always written by those who deserve it. And that courage sometimes looks like restraint, but other times, it looks like honesty spoken plainly, even as the world watches. Catherine had long balanced the impossible, upholding the institution while refusing to let it consume her. And in Charlotte, she planted the same seeds. Not to destroy what came before, but to question it, to reshape it, to hold the past accountable by remembering it clearly. That night, no documents were signed, no speeches were made. But something changed forever. A vow, anchored in emotion rather than politics, to honor the woman who was loved, lost, and too often left out of the royal story. And while the world debated protocol, Charlotte's quiet resistance had already ignited a powerful cultural shift, one not even the crown could contain. The royal family thrives on unity. But Charlotte's words fractured that illusion. Across the UK and beyond, people chose sides. Was this a child manipulated, or a truth-teller born from history? Within days of Charlotte's whispered rebellion leaking to the press, the public mood began to split like glass under pressure. Commentators, once aligned in scripted reverence, found themselves pulled into a debate they couldn't control. What began as whispers inside the palace became a global referendum on legacy, grief, and power. Overnight, polls revealed a startling divide. Nearly 50% of the public stood with Camilla, citing tradition, respect, and the importance of healing royal rifts. But the other half? They chose Charlotte, not just as a child, but as a symbol. A voice untouched by decades of spin. A figure many viewed not as manipulated, but as miraculously unfiltered in a family where every word is weighed, measured, and trimmed. The internet erupted into battle. #NotMyQueen climbed across social platforms, turning timelines into war zones of opinion. Memes cast Charlotte in heroic light, Diana's granddaughter, standing in defiance of the woman once blamed for Diana's heartbreak. TikToks dissected her body language, speculating on the true meaning behind her tone. Meanwhile, royal loyalists pushed back. They called for restraint, for protection, for Charlotte's privacy. And yet, their attempts to shut down the conversation only added fuel to the fire. Because this wasn't just about the monarchy, it was about who the public believed had the right to shape its narrative. Generational lines carved deeper. For those under 35, Charlotte wasn't seen as insubordinate, she was seen as brave. A child who had dared to say what many in her generation already believed, that the old rules no longer held. That deference without accountability was no longer acceptable. To them, Charlotte was the embodiment of a truth suppressed for too long. To older monarchists, however, her words were dangerous. A child, speaking out of turn. A moment, they insisted, orchestrated by parents who should have known better. Their voices echoed in op-eds and call-ins, pleading for a return to discipline, tradition, and quiet obedience. Outside the UK, the story took on a life of its own. In the United States, tabloids splashed Charlotte's image across their covers, dubbing her Diana's Justice. Morning shows ran back-to-back specials comparing the young princess to the late Princess of Wales, drawing uncomfortable parallels between Charlotte's honesty and Diana's defiance. Commentators suggested that perhaps the monarchy hadn't learned from its past, but the younger generation had. And that realization, quiet and devastating, began to chip away at the royal family's carefully guarded soft power, not through scandal, not through betrayal, but through truth. For the firm, this was unfamiliar territory. They knew how to handle missteps, rumors, even internal conflict. But they had never faced a narrative they couldn't counter, because it wasn't theirs to control. It belonged to a child. And the public had already chosen to believe her. Every failed press attempt, every avoided question, every silence from the palace only underscored the growing truth, that something had shifted, and that shift had consequences far beyond public perception. But even as the firm braced for more fallout, they weren't ready for what came next. Charlotte speaking again, this time on camera. She wasn't supposed to speak, not at this age, not like this. But during a charity event, with cameras rolling, Charlotte faced a reporter's question about Queen Camilla and responded with devastating calm. What she said next would be quoted for generations. The event was meant to be lighthearted, a children's charity gala filled with music, laughter, and carefully staged photo opportunities. The press had been briefed no sensitive topics, no questions about recent headlines. And for a time, everything held to script. Charlotte moved between guests with the kind of quiet confidence the public had come to admire. But then, as the cameras lingered a moment too long, a reporter, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps chasing a viral moment, stepped forward with a question that would bring the monarchy to its knees. "Do you admire Queen Camilla?" It was casual, almost innocent. The kind of question meant to fill a soundbite and vanish into background noise. But Charlotte didn't blink. She didn't turn to her mother or search for a rehearsed line. She looked directly at the reporter and said, "She's part of the family, but my queen will always be someone else." Silence fell instantly, the kind that suffocates. For a brief moment, no one moved. Catherine, standing nearby, stepped closer but did not interrupt. She placed a hand on Charlotte's back, gently steering her away, but said nothing. No corrections. No damage control. Because she knew the moment had already happened, and there would be no undoing it. Within minutes, the clip spread across social media like wildfire. It was raw, unscripted, and utterly human. Millions watched as Charlotte, with composure far beyond her years, delivered a truth that even adult royals had avoided for decades. Her words weren't laced with malice. They didn't need to be. The clarity alone was enough to devastate. By the time the palace was notified, it was too late. The footage had been shared across continents, subtitled in half a dozen languages, and dissected by every news outlet imaginable. Some headlines heralded her as a voice of reason in a family drowned by tradition. Others condemned the moment as recklessness, a failure of parental control, a PR disaster of historic scale. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about a comment. It was about a generational shift so seismic that even the crown couldn't contain it. Camilla's camp responded with fury. Behind closed doors, aides demanded a swift and public clarification. There were calls for Catherine to release a statement, for William to intervene. But neither came. Charles, blindsided and betrayed, was said to be livid yet paralyzed. How does a monarch discipline a child for expressing loyalty to the very woman whose memory still haunts the institution he leads? He could issue no formal reprimand. To do so would ignite a firestorm the palace could never control. And in that inaction, the truth settled deeper. Protocol had been shattered. The firm structure, built on silence and symmetry, had been pierced by a voice it had never planned for. Charlotte had done something extraordinary. In less than 10 words, she had redefined what it meant to belong to the monarchy. Not through rebellion, not through spectacle, but through something far more potent: clarity. In a world of scripted loyalty and curated affection, she had chosen honesty. And the world listened. From Buckingham to Boston, Sydney to South Africa, her voice resonated not because of her title, but because of her truth. With one voice and a steady gaze, Charlotte had declared something more dangerous than rebellion. She had declared independence. What happens when a future queen decides to remember instead of obey? Charlotte may not sit on the throne for decades, but already, she's rewriting what it means to wear the crown. And the monarchy may never be the same. In a family where silence is survival and tradition is power, Charlotte's words were not just personal, they were prophetic. With one sentence, she exposed the quiet rebellion simmering beneath the gold leaf and etiquette. And though she is still just a child, her message cracked through generations of palace doctrine. Because what Charlotte did was bigger than defy a name. She acknowledged a truth so many had been forced to forget. She reminded the world that history doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient, and that reverence, without memory, is hollow. The monarchy, long built on image, now finds itself face to face with something far more dangerous than scandal: honesty. The spirit of Diana never vanished, it evolved. Not in marble statues or curated tributes, but in Charlotte's unfiltered conviction. The so-called people's princess lives on, not in pageantry, but in her granddaughter's voice. A voice that speaks not for headlines, but for healing. Where Diana was once silenced by the crown's weight, Charlotte refuses to be bound by it. This isn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's a declaration that legacy belongs to those who remember, not those who rewrite. And that distinction could very well become the defining principle of her future reign. Charlotte stands at a rare crossroads between two monarchies, one built on stoic endurance, the other on evolving relevance. She isn't tethered to the rules that governed her grandmother's fate, nor fully defined by the power her father will one day inherit. She exists in between, in the space where truth and duty must find a new balance. And as that space grows, so too does the public's hunger for something real. No longer is the crown solely measured in titles or tiaras. It's measured in courage. And Charlotte, with all the innocence of youth, has already shown more of it than many twice her age. Observers once asked what kind of queen Charlotte would be. That question no longer needs answering, it's already unfolding. Because now, everything she says, every move she makes, will be seen through the lens of that first truth. Not with suspicion, but with expectation. The public isn't waiting for a perfect monarch, they're waiting for an honest one. And that desire, more than any coronation, is what could shape the future of the British throne. William and Catherine, often perceived as guardians of tradition, now appear in a different light, protectors of authenticity. Not because they support defiance, but because they understand the cost of suppression. And perhaps that's why the palace has chosen silence. Not because it doesn't know how to respond, but because it knows any response would validate what it fears most, that the truth is no longer theirs to control. In that silence, Charlotte's voice only grows louder. It reverberates through the very walls built to contain it, through a monarchy caught between remembrance and reinvention. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what the future needs. And so, as royal portraits hang heavy on palace walls, one young girl's defiant whisper may echo longer than 1,000 royal decrees. She is not my queen. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.